So, I know I've mentioned shaking voices a couple times, but let me assure you that when it comes to fear, I am a pro. I know what I'm talking about. I am a classic white-knuckle flyer. I did not learn to ride a bike until my 19th birthday because I was afraid to fall over. I have been afraid to exit the ski lift, to get bangs, and just generally go backwards. Back dive, backwards roll, backing into a parking space. No. If you told me I was going to give you a sermon about fear as a spiritual practice, and that fear, facing fear, would be one day one of my strongest spiritual practices, I would not have believed you. But I've also always been a little fascinated by fear. As a kid, I tore an article out of a women's magazine that gave a list of unusual fears that people had. I put it on my bulletin board. It was there for years. Some days I'd wake up and I would see it. Fear of sitting down. Fear of antique furniture. I hear Billy Bob Thornton actually has that. Fear of string. So let me assure you as we get started that whatever your fears are, you are not alone. Everyone is afraid, or as Forrest Church described on his list, chicken-hearted about something. Some fears are more pressing than others, though, and we are going to get to that. In recent years, I've faced off with some of my own deepest fears and anxieties, either by accident, by choice, or through loss. And in doing so, I've seen how facing fear can help us answer questions like, what do I want most in life? What is my purpose here? If we peek at what's behind our fears, like Grover, we may simply find our lovable, furry old selves. Fear is a big topic, so we're going to start very, very small. We're going to start with grapes. All my life, I ate green grapes. I would not be caught dead near red grapes. I was a green grape person, like being a Beatles person versus a Stones person. Until one day, about 10 years ago, I was on an airplane, keeping it up with the power of my mind. I'm told that Dalai Lama does this too, so we're in good company. When my meal came, I offered the stranger next to me my red grapes. You don't want them, he said. No, I only eat the green ones, I said, as if this were a sane thing. Why? They taste the same. What? Yeah, they're all the same. Are you serious? Why didn't anybody tell me? This was our conversation. I paused for the first time in the air and asked myself what I had against red grapes. The answer was, I had no idea. Zero. Maybe my mom usually bought green ones when I was a kid. Maybe something was going on with the grape boycott in the 80s and we only had green ones. I don't know. But that's what I was used to. And somehow what I was used to evolved into, oh no, I hate that. Get that away from me. Ew. And that's a lot like how other, bigger fears work too. The unknown becomes the feared, and ugly, self-defeating habits develop. So I looked at the airplane grapes, really looked at them, and I put one in my mouth. You have to understand, the 10 years ago me, this was a very big deal. And it did taste just like a green one. It still blows my mind. If I had had more time, I was going to bring green grapes and red grapes so you guys could have some out there with your coffee. But trust me, they're just about the same. You probably already knew that. By this time in our lives, how often do our senses experience something totally new? What a gift. What a spiritual experience. That one question from one stranger, one grape, changed my life. If I had been wrong about red grapes, what else had I been wrong about all these years? I started to try new things, one at a time. Avocados, creme brulee, writing a song, something in Nicaragua called the monster swing. I got bangs. And suddenly I was living out my Unitarian Universalist values in a way I never expected. I joined a community-supported agriculture organization with other members of my Chicago church. So every Friday I opened a box of local vegetables and found at least one I had never seen, let alone tasted. So here was this new thrill, cooking, and I found myself a part of the ethical eating movement in my own small way. We have a lot of bigger fears to talk about than food, but it is clear to me that in facing fears as a spiritual practice, it is just fine for you to start small. Whatever is holding you back, whatever is keeping you from action, you have to start somewhere. So thanks to these grapes, whenever I run up against a case of my own fear, stubbornness, prejudice, I know what to do now. You can do it too. Ask yourself, why do I think this? How did I get here? Do I really have to say no to this? What if I said yes? What if I did something differently? These are very you questions. And in fact, church is a great place to tackle some fears that are as common as they are debilitating. Fear of intimacy, fear of asking for help, fear of change. From saying hi in coffee hour, seeking out the care team when you need it, getting involved with a capital campaign so this church can grow and change, we have a way for you to conquer some of those kinds of fears. And with the Standing on the Side of Love campaign, which is national and international, UUs are committed to getting our nation past its fear of marriage equality, immigration reform, and a lot of really important issues. Now, on behalf of the contrarians among us, and I know who some of you are, before we go any further, I'm going to pose another question. What is so wrong with being afraid? Well, nothing in some cases, and I bet you can think of some. I'm petrified of my kids, 2 and 5, running into traffic, falling out a window, and those fears make me a more diligent parent. But many fears are doing none of us any favors. There's research from Stanford that suggests that prolonged worry and anxiety may lead to memory loss and brain damage, shortening life expectancy by raising blood pressure, stress levels. So basically, fear causes the thing that many of us fear the most, death. For the longest time, my greatest fear was dying. I just didn't want to do it. I don't want my family members to go that route either. There is a scene in the mystery comedy Clue. Has anybody seen Clue? All right. Where Professor Plum asks, "What are you afraid of? A fate worse than death?" And Mrs. Peacock responds, "No, just death. Isn't that enough?" Every time I saw that scene, I was like, that is what I'm talking about. But the thing about the fear of death is that sooner or later we all have to face it, and worrying about it is not going to stop that. When I was 7, my parents split up, and I began worrying that something would happen to my dad when we weren't together. Like I needed to keep him alive like the plane with my presence, my thoughts. When either of my parents was late to pick me up from school or a play date, I panicked. And then, of course, 18 years later, that thing I worried about happened. My dad, this hilarious cowboy, seemingly perfect health, suffered a heart attack, was in a coma for 5 days, and died at age 55. Friend after friend stood up at my dad's funeral and said, "David Walter was supposed to give my eulogy." My world ended just like I feared it would. It'll be 11 years this month. But you learn something huge when you face your worst fear. The kind of fear that makes red grapes seem like grapes. You can live through it. Life goes on. It can still be good. So, Have you ever noticed how the very things that terrify some of us are the same things that thrill other people? Bungee jumping, sushi, dancing, diversity, traveling, being alone, being in a crowd, falling in love, saying hi in coffee hour. This dichotomy tells us something. I'm not asking you to skydive if you don't want to. I have zero interest in being the person on the front of your order of service, flying through the sky. If you take a look, that's not going to be me. And I'm okay with that. But I'm asking you to think about a fear that secretly calls to you. Something that speaks to a deeper need or concern in your life. Think about it. Just give it some time. I'd be happy to hear what you come up with. Grab me next week. Grab me anytime. Just give it some thought. So another key thing about facing fear is that it's not a one-shot deal. You do it over and over again. That's how it becomes a spiritual practice, like prayer and meditation, loving kindness. You just keep deciding over and over again that you're not going to live in avoidance. You're going to take courage, whatever it is. One holiday break, I had to face my dad's death again by going through his things in storage with my stepmom. His cowboy hats, military medals, photographs, singing mounted fish. I was afraid, you guys. Could I handle being in a cold storage room with all of his special things? Things that didn't even smell like him anymore. Things I hated to admit he would never touch again. What if I'd waited too long? What if there was nothing left for me to treasure? As is usually the case, those fears were unfounded. Bless you. The experience was almost entirely a joyful one. I felt close to him. I knew that I was helping my stepmom. And those voices in my head that said I wasn't doing what I was supposed to do, those were quiet now, and I knew that I had. For many of you who share my fear of death, I want to give you the most important news. That in the end, the moment of my father's passing was peaceful and even beautiful. And he is not gone. He's here. Always with me. Love is so much stronger than fear. Now, I said some fears are more pressing than others, and so I want to talk to you now about the role fear is playing in current events and how you can do something about it. Because the sad fact is that not all deaths are peaceful and beautiful. And for many people here and abroad, my father's short 55-year life would be very long indeed. I always come back to this quote from the poet Robert Bly. Wherever the wound appears in our psyche, that is precisely the place from which we will give our major gift to the community. Please think about it, and I'm going to say it again. Wherever the wound appears in our psyche, that is precisely the place from which we will give our major gift to the community. Do you feel wounded this week? I do. How can we make a gift of it? I think about Robin Williams' suicide and the need to better treat depression and mental illness. I think about refugee children coming across U.S. borders desperate for help. Mass incarceration, conflicts abroad, discrimination and abuse of transgender men and women, the needs of each community in our country. The roots of the problems are deep and tangled. My greatest fear is no longer death, but that we will not make enough change in my lifetime. To fulfill our mission, to transform lives and do justice, we have to look our fears in the eye. Fear that we are too small, that the problems are too big, fear that there is nothing we can really do, scientifically unfounded fears that refugee children are sicker than our own children, and nonsense like that. Then we need to summon our courage and get to work. Get people registered to vote and vote. Volunteer with justice organizations in this church and outside of it. Give money to organizations providing aid, work on legal challenges. Pressure your elected officials to change those laws that are oppressing our people. There are easy forms and email addresses and good old-fashioned phone numbers on the internet. I urge you to start this week, and how about every week, with a half hour of pestering people in power about the things that matter to you. We cannot be too paralyzed by fear to take real action. And we cannot let fear stop us from talking face to face about Ferguson, about America, about Austin, about racism and injustice. Greg Howard wrote a powerful piece for the online magazine Deadspin this week titled, "America is Not for Black People." I couldn't bring myself to read it for a couple days. I kept it open on my computer. The headline alone was just too painful. But what I know from my practice of facing fear is that the fear of reading it meant that I needed to read it. In the piece, Howard describes, quote, "a very real, very American fear of Black men." He writes, we are inexplicably seen as a million-strong army of potential killers, capable and cold enough that any single one could be a threat to a trained police officer in a bulletproof vest. There are reasons why white gun rights activists can walk into a Chipotle restaurant with assault rifles and be seen as gauche nuisances, while unarmed Black men are killed for reaching for their wallets or cell phones or carrying children's toys. These things are happening, and it's not just Ferguson. Mike Brown's death is part of a very big, heartbreaking picture that we have to work to improve: laws, attitudes, accountability. And we can't do that if we're too scared to talk to each other, if we can't say these words out loud, and we can't be in this together. There's a fear of failure, a fear that we will say the wrong thing, a fear that everything will come out wrong and we will just make it worse. I have that fear standing before you. I had that fear thinking about this week. I can't pretend to have all the answers. But I feel in my heart that the only way we can make racism and abuse of power and gross inequality worse right now is by giving up, by not caring, by putting a happy face on it, by looking away. Earlier this year, I attended Baha'i Racial Unity Day at San Marcos UU Fellowship, and the lay leader read this unforgettable quote from the Reverend Dr. Rebecca Parker. "The inner journey of anti-racism for whites involves learning to withdraw our negative and positive associations and projections from people of color. Whites must become relationally committed to meeting people of color as themselves, not as symbolic extensions of ourselves." Friends and church members of color, it is not your job to educate those of us who are white. It is our job to do our work. But as a member of this congregation, I very much want to hear what you have to say about creating a church and a world that is true to our mission. Those of us who are white, we must rise above the tendency to take things personally. We must be present to hear and feel the individual experiences of people of color. We must seek them out. Read, talk to people. Don't be afraid to hear. When so many say, as Allie Barthwell wrote in XO Jane this week, that they are terrified of police, we mustn't try to debate those feelings. We must not equate the loss of life, we must not equate oppression to property damage. It's about understanding that current events do not happen in a vacuum and recognizing, as we say in the Unitarian Universalist Church, the inherent worth and dignity of all people. in closing, the tasks ahead of us, all of us, are daunting, scary. But my experience with the spiritual practice of facing fear, from now seemingly petty fears like food or styles, to something as personal as losing a loved one, is that we can tackle this. We can overcome these fears we have, even the biggest, most ingrained ones. We don't have to be perfect, but we have what it takes. At the vigil for Mike Brown at the Capitol on Thursday, who did I see there but adults and children from this congregation? You're getting started. When your own fear of saying the wrong thing is about to halt a conversation that needs to be had, be brave. Remember that there are others in this country who fear for their children walking down the street, who fear the dangers of a drug war they did not start, who live in unsafe conditions in part due to unjust laws and a lack of a living wage. And there are even those with an equally tragic but far more modern fear that if I, for example, as a white mother of a white son, do not teach my son well, and maybe even if I do, he could end up as the shooter in a school, in a movie theater, in SWAT gear, in a racially charged tragedy like Ferguson. Only people with their eyes truly closed believe that these things are not at our windows, not at our doors to see, that they're happening somewhere else. They're happening everywhere. So I'm acknowledging those fears today out loud before you so that we may know that they are real and so that we may start to really overcome them, really. Let us not be downtrodden. Let us not borrow sorrow, as the saying goes, from the people of Ferguson. Instead, let's be the ones who use our privileges, one of which is witnessing Ferguson's plight from a physical distance, to do the work of racial reconciliation, social justice, and human rights. We must rest and work, pray and work, meditate and work, dance for joy and work. Let's overcome our fears, you guys. Let's shine our lights brightly and be the change that we want to see for us all. Thank you for listening with loving hearts today.